It's an honor to meet you, uh, Professor Horn. And there's a ton of questions that we have, but we would like you just to tell us more, tell the viewing audience more about yourself and what drives you to seek the truth at this point.
Well, thank you for inviting me on this April 21st, 2022. My biography is easy to find. There was a special issue of the Journal of African American History that people can look that up about me about a decade ago. And then the Activist News Network did a 9-part biographical series on me that you can find at YouTube. So I won't divert our valuable time into that, but I will jump right into the Ukraine crisis, which has the potential to tip into World War III, which could mean the end of all humanity, including Black people, by the way. And that is one reason amongst many that our community should be engaged. This crisis, however, represents a kind of crisis for our community as well, because if you look at how African nations and Caribbean nations have been voting at the United Nations on the Ukraine crisis, you'll find that the nations like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Algeria, Namibia, nations with which we've had a historic relationship, have not voted in favor of the US position, which calls for sanctioning, marginalizing, and isolating Russia in light of their intervention in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Not only that, but nations like India, China, Iran have voted similarly. And our community should ask ourselves why it is that African nations, despite all of this propaganda that has been unleashed from New York and Washington in particular, have decided not to stand alongside New York and Washington. And I think that this is for a number of reasons. One, there is a detection of hypocrisy on the US side. That is to say that all of a sudden we're supposed to endorse boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Russia, but not endorse boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, despite its depredations in historic Palestine. And then, of course, there's the question of how African students are being maltreated and mistreated as they flee Ukraine, where many of them have been studying, and flee into Poland, the neighbor of Ukraine, a close US ally. And yet the reports that have been coming across the transom concerning their maltreatment is quite chilling. In fact, even the US government station, Voice of America, has been carrying very chilling reports about their maltreatment and mistreatment. And I think that that influences African nations as well. And then if you look at the larger scheme of things, and this will be more difficult to prove, but there are those who are suggesting that this crisis represents an opportunity to deliver a stunning and staggering blow to US imperialism and to white supremacy, and to inaugurate a new world order altogether. And as I said, this is speculative at this point on April 21st, 2022, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility, particularly as you see this movement away from the US dollar, which has been a major prop of US imperialism and white supremacy. You see this with regard to the supposed US ally that is India, soon to be the most populous nation on planet Earth, but has historic ties to Moscow, stretching back to Indian independence in 1947, you see that India is now buying Russian energy on the cheap and then consummating the trade in either Indian rupees or Russian rubles. Historically, that kind of trade would have been consummated in dollars. You also see the supposed US ally, that is Saudi Arabia, now selling its valuable commodity, that is petroleum, and moving towards selling it to China using Chinese currency as opposed to the US dollar. I should couple that statement with the point that even Israel, which can detect which way the winds are blowing, has not only reduced the amount of US dollars in its foreign reserves, that is to say, in its piggy bank, but has increased the amount of Chinese currency, the yuan or renminbi. And in fact, Israel has been accused credibly of leaking US sophisticated military technology to China as it seeks to hedge, presumably because it takes seriously the point that I just made, that we may be on the cusp of a new international situation in which, quite frankly, the leaders of planet Earth will no longer be the North Atlantic countries, but it will be a conglomeration of countries led by the People's Republic of China. And of course, I could go into how that happened over the last half century if you're interested. But back to, sorry, did you say?
Yeah, I am. But I would like, a lot of people, when we talk about World War III, they don't visualize that World War III will be a catastrophe. What I wanted you to throw in there is, will New York and the cities of America, which have never really saw bombs flying over, and what would that look like for us? We would not be escaping the way we think we're escaping. So if you can kind of draw a picture, and please go back to the background and history.
Well, if you want to get a glimpse of what it might look like, go online and look at the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, August 6th, August 9th, 1945.
Yes, hello.
Tens of thousands of people were immolated, killed instantaneously within seconds. And then, as the saying went, the living envied the dead because of the kinds of cancers that emerged as a result of an atomic bombing. And reference also the report from Moscow just yesterday, April 20th, 2022, about the development of a new intercontinental ballistic missile that can deliver warheads, yes, to New York City, yes, to New Jersey, yes, to Connecticut, yes, to Pennsylvania, yes, to Los Angeles, yes, to Chicago, throughout the United States of America, because you're living in this country that is now waging war against Russia, which by some measures has more nuclear warheads than the United States does. As I told an outlet yesterday, the United States, it reminds me, if you're familiar with Floyd Mayweather, the boxer, it would be as if instead of warming up to fight Manny Pacquiao, he would fight Earl Spencer. He had been fighting the Little Sisters of the Poor, basically mendicant nuns, for example. So the United States, they invaded Grenada in 1983, which has a adult population that could fit comfortably into Yankee Stadium. They, of course, overthrew Gaddafi in Libya 2011, which only has a population of about 9 to 10 to 11 million. But now they're dealing with a heavyweight, that is Russia. But in any case, let me go back to the thread about what this means for Africa. and then
Yes, please.
I'll let you follow up. Well, so what this means for Africa is that if the United States and its allies in Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, etc., decide to boycott Russian natural gas to keep their homes warm in the winter, they'll have to turn to Algerian natural gas. And Algeria, which has a competent government and is accustomed to playing hardball, interestingly enough, it's been playing hardball with recipients of its natural gas, speaking of Spain and Italy, and manipulating one against another. Now, this is a turnabout because we're accustomed to European nations manipulating African nations one against the other, or one ethnic group against another ethnic group. But now, with this developing international situation, you see the shoe is on the other foot. If the Western Europeans decide to boycott Russian oil, they'll have to turn to Nigerian oil and Angolan oil. If they boycott Russian palladium, which is useful for the green economy, the construction of catalytic converters, which you find on automobiles that reduce pollution. And of course, there's a thriving market, at least in Texas, of folks stealing catalytic converters from cars and making a nice living doing so. So if palladium from Russia is boycotted, that means you have to turn to South African palladium. If France needs uranium for its nuclear plants and they boycott Russian uranium, they have to turn to Namibian uranium. So this suggests that the Western European nations, led and their US master, will become ever more dependent upon Africa. Now, this has it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, as my case of Algeria tends to suggest, it gives African nations a certain amount of leverage. But on the other hand, it also suggests that the US and its allies may want to interfere more blatantly in the internal affairs of African nations and try to put into power stooges and chumps who will act like puppets. So these are the stakes that are involved with regard to this conflict in Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why I suggested that you have many African nations, many Asian nations, Caribbean nations, not necessarily standing with Uncle Sam, although there's been an eerie quiet and silence from many of our Black intellectuals and leaders, perhaps because they know history. They know that when Black leaders speak out on foreign policy, as Martin Luther King did on Vietnam, or as Paul Robeson did 75 odd years ago, when he sought to bring the United States before the United Nations, that there's oftentimes hell to pay. I mean, you can speak out on domestic issues, but speaking out against US priorities, and Ukraine is certainly a priority, oftentimes brings a sledgehammer down on your head. But at the same time, I don't see how we can live through this contradiction. What I mean is, the New York Times just a day or two ago, there was a story about Black men, unsheltered, unhoused, homeless, dying like flies on the streets of Los Angeles. At the same time, Mr. Biden, the US president, has been shipping hundreds of millions of dollars, authorized by Congress, billions of dollars to Ukraine. Now, how can any Black person worth their salt accept that scandalous state of affairs where our people are dying? That's not even getting into the question of hunger. Our people are dying, and yet our tax dollars are going for this war in Central and Eastern Europe. Please.
Now, is it white supremacy? Because the primary reason why I see that we can't have peace and harmony on the earth is white supremacy. There is enough. They are talking about putting solar panels all across the desert that will create enough solar energy to fuel Europe, but none of these lines are going back into Africa, which needs the fuel like everybody else. But if we had solar energy and the panels that actually China makes most of these panels, that we could bring about enough energy that you really wouldn't need the oil. But is this war about oil? Why can't, from your perspective, why can't we come together and talk about this rather than destroying the whole planet? How everybody can get along. I mean, I know I'm throwing it out there and I might sound a little out of the way, but is white supremacy the reason we can't come together? White supremacy and capitalism?
By we, you mean humanity, I take it.
Humanity, yes.
Yes. Well, certainly that is a major factor, to put it mildly. To go back to the point that I made a moment or two ago, where I suggested that something may be in motion, but it's difficult to say that definitively it will occur. I think what's happening in part is that the United States and its allies have been dominating the world, I argue, since the 1500s. There have been major challenges to that hegemony. There have been major challenges to white supremacy since that time. There have been major challenges to capitalism since that time. But generally speaking, the US and its allies, the United States, of course, coming into being in, say, 1776, Britain before that, that they've been able to dispense with these challenges. But now it's not clear if the United States and its allies will be able to dispense with this challenge, because as I see it, the war in Ukraine is an indirect way to weaken China. That is to say, the United States, not least since the Obama years, has been talking about a pivot towards Asia, because the economists and the futurologists tell us that the 21st century will be an Asian century, or you can reduce it to the 21st century being a century which sees the rise of China. But the United States finds it difficult to confront China directly and frontally, because that would mean confronting Tesla and Apple and Microsoft and GM and Starbucks and Apple and all of the other US corporations that are heavily invested in China. And so the idea is you weaken China's major ally, which is Russia, and then that in turn weakens China. Or alternatively, as Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen put it a few days ago, if China does not observe US sanctions against Russia, then the United States and its allies will then seek to sanction China. Sanction means try to destroy their economy, try to boycott, divest from their economy, which is more than a notion, because as I said, there's so much US investment in China. And so I think with regard to your point concerning solar, you raised the point of solar energy, which of course is the energy of the future, but it's going to be very difficult to go cold turkey on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels meaning gasoline that you put in your car, for example. That's an example of a fossil fuel. It's going to be very difficult to go cold turkey on fossil fuels and switch all of a sudden to solar energy or non-fossil fuels, because if you look out your window, you won't see that many electric cars on the street. I would say you might see 3%. And so for some time to come, people are going to be going to the gas station to fill up. And then these electric cars, if you look at the cost of a Tesla, if you walk out of a showroom spending less than $50,000, you should consider yourself lucky for an electric car. I recall a time, I'm old enough to remember, when you spent $50,000 for a house.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that barely gets you an electric car. So you're going to need, for some time to come, there's going to be gasoline powered cars. And so even if there is a major shift towards so-called clean energy, solar energy, et cetera, there's still going to be a need for these gasoline powered cars for some time to come. And as you already suggested, China is now the major player with regard to solar energy. And so if you look at Tesla, for example, Elon Musk, I'm sure you're familiar, they're making cars in China. That's one of their biggest manufacturing facilities and one of their biggest markets. And so the United States has a real problem right now. And I could explain how and why it is that China is in the passing lane right now. Because China is in the passing lane, not least because the United States helped to create the conditions allowing China to be in the passing lane. And once again, it goes back to Moscow, because about 50 years ago, the United States was quite concerned about the rise of the Soviet Union. So they cut a deal with China. And even though you had communist parties in Moscow and in Beijing, they were at each other's throats. And so the United States cut a deal with China against the interests of the Soviet Union, which helped to weaken the Soviet Union. And in return, China got massive foreign direct investment as the payoff. And China did their dirty work as well. I could go into that if you're interested. Some of it's reflected in Southern Africa.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
No, go into that because, you know, when you begin to look at historical steps that led us to where we are today, you have to look at the history of both Russia and America and China and how their positioning against one another brought them to where we are today. So, yes, I would like for you to explain that.
Excuse me, Dr. Horne, Minister Brown.
Yes.
If I could ask a few questions. One thing, is this conflict more than just a strategic conflict between nations such as NATO and the USSR? Is this really of a war motivated by oil at this point? Because when you think about it, the largest consumer of fossil fuels is the US military, which is the largest military on the planet. And you can't fly an F-35 jet fighter on a solar panel. Just looking at some figures right now of a typical US tank battalion of 348 tanks consumes 2.3 million liters of fuel per day. An aircraft carrier battle division uses 1.6 million liters per day. And that's not counting all of the logistics involved. So, and we're just talking about, you know, the largest military entity on the planet. That doesn't include all of the Russian military. That doesn't include China. That doesn't include North and South Korea or Israel or all of the military conflicts, large and small, that are going on throughout the world. So all of that runs on oil. So oil equals power. Now, who is in control of that oil? How much money is to be made on account of that? Now, with that in mind, the largest contributor, the largest emitter of of um, of
Greenhouse
greenhouse
gas.
gases, yes, is the military at this point. So are we at the crossroads where we're given a choice to die fast or die slow? Like if we choose to die fast, then it's a scenario like the kind of scenario that you see in the Terminator Hollywood flicks, or in the or in that film War Games, where everybody in a nuclear exchange are releasing their silos so they won't get caught with this, with the missiles in the silos, leading to a nuclear winter. Of From reports that I'm hearing right now, if there was just so much as one detonation, that would be enough to tip global warming to a point of no return. But on the other hand, if they're consuming the fossil fuels at the rate that they're using, that in itself may be the tipping point where uh, where we reach a point of no return as far as global warming is concerned. Now, this is all based on technology. I remember seeing the first solar panels back in the 70s, and they never invested the amount of money that they needed to. The question is why? You know, I mean, it was about monopoly. Who was going to control
Let, let, let,
the energy?
let Professor Horne answer the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, but yeah, that's my question. Number one, is this really a war about oil? And if that's the case, has the game changed? And are we at the crossroads at this point?
Well, first of all, with regard to oil, the three major oil producers on planet Earth are the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. The United States would like to have regime change in Moscow. And if the United States does execute regime change in Moscow, certainly it would give the United States more control over the global oil and petroleum supply, not to mention natural gas supply, which would then give it leverage not only over Western Europe, where those two commodities, petroleum and natural gas, are oftentimes exported from Russia, but also give it leverage over China. However, the problem is that executing regime change in Moscow is more than a notion. And the United States might have bitten off more than it could chew. And you see it with regard to trying to get Saudi Arabia, which is also a major oil producer, to cooperate with the United States. You might have seen the article in the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago, which said that the Saudi leadership was not accepting calls from President Biden. They're upset with the United States for reasons I could go into if you're interested. Yeah. But you want me to go into it?
Please.
Yes, please.
Okay. Saudis are upset with the United States because, one, the Saudis would like the United States to take a harder line towards Iran. Iran is supporting their comrades in Saudi's neighbor, speaking of Yemen. And the Saudis are waging a war in Yemen. They've been waging the war for about, 7 years now. There have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of casualties. And by the way, I think that's one of the many reasons why you have these African nations not standing alongside of Washington with regard to Russia, because they say, why are we having all this concern about Ukraine? Like this is the first war that has been fought in recent years. And you've had a war going on in Yemen with refugees being refused in Europe at the same time that they're being welcomed into homes, private homes in Britain. You've had Airbnb subsidize the residencies of Ukrainian refugees throughout Western Europe. But in any case, back to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is concerned about the United States trying to negotiate this nuclear deal with Iran, which is supposedly going to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, which Iran says it does not want in any case. Israel is also upset with the United States because of its negotiations with Iran. So that's one reason, the Iran issue. why Saudi Arabia won't accept the phone calls of Mr. Biden. And then a few years ago, the Saudis killed a prominent Saudi dissident, Jamal Khashoggi, who also wrote for the Washington Post. They did it in a very gruesome manner. He visited a consulate of the Saudis in Istanbul, Turkey.
I remember, yeah.
And they invited him in and then chopped him up like he was a Thanksgiving turkey. And his body has never been found, by the way. However, the Turks were monitoring the Saudi consulate. And so they have it all on audio and video, what happened. And Mr. Biden said during his campaign that he was going to try to isolate Saudi Arabia as a result of this gruesome killing. And the Saudis are not happy about that. And the Saudis also want more military assistance from the United States to fight the war in Yemen. And Mr. Biden said that he's not going to supply it. However, he's probably going to have to change his mind because the United States feels that it needs more oil pumped so that the supply will grow and the price of a gallon will fall. You have people in California now easily paying $5, $6, sometimes $7 a gallon, which is quite a turnabout. Once again, I'm old enough to remember when a gallon of gasoline cost 30 cents. Now, obviously, I'm an old guy, but still,
Okay. Yeah.
that's quite a jump. And so the question on the table is this conflict over Russia and Ukraine about oil? I would say only in part. It's a significant part, but it's not the whole story. Washington also feels that Russia cooperates with Cuba, which it does. Washington feels that Russia cooperates with Venezuela and Nicaragua, which it does. Washington would like to see all three of those regimes overthrown, and they feel that Russia is a stumbling block. So there are many reasons for this conflict between Russia and the United States.
Yeah, I'm familiar with what you was talking about with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, because I don't know if you saw on YouTube, they had the famous sword dance with Donald Trump, who was president at the time, and Rex Tillerson, who was CEO of ExxonMobil, who was appointed by Trump to be Secretary of State at the time. So they was doing that famous sword dance because they made a $1.1 billion sale of military weaponry for them to continue their war against Yemen. I'm very much familiar with that. One question, you would mention there's a organization called Gazprom? Gazprom, right? Is there any relationship between Gazprom and say Donald Trump, during his time in office as president, or before that time?
Well, first of all, with regard to your first point, as a result of sanctions against Russia, supposedly ExxonMobil, which was investing heavily in Russia, will be forced to liquidate its interests in Russia and pull out. We'll see if that happens. Secondly, this brings me back to the point I was making a few moments ago, whereas if you boycott Russia with regard to energy, you're basically putting more emphasis on Nigerian and Angolan and Algerian energy. Likewise, ExxonMobil has major interests in Guyana. Of course, you have many Guyanese in Brooklyn, as I'm sure you know. And the Guyanese are now struggling with ExxonMobil to make sure they're not taken to the cleaners. Given the fact that ExxonMobil may be pulling out of Russia, that's going to put more emphasis on the oil fields off the coast of Guyana. So people should keep an eye on that. With regard to Gazprom supplies natural gas to Western European homes. That's what I was making reference to a moment ago.
Yeah.
As we speak, the Europeans who are asking everybody all over the world to boycott Russia, they send Russia $1 billion a day, including right now, for energy. So, in other words, they're saying, do what we say, not what we do, which is that kind of hypocrisy we're quite familiar with in the United States of America. And what's interesting is that Gazprom is not only a natural gas producer, Gazprom also has a bank. And the United States has called for a boycott of Russian banks, except for Gazprom, interestingly enough. And so it's the number 3 bank in Russia right now. And if the boycott of number 1 and 2 banks continue, probably by the end of the year, if not by the end of next month, it'll be the number 1 bank. That's part of the contradictions of trying to fight this economic war with Russia. Now, with regard to the 45th US president, a lot of his ties to Moscow remain murky, to put it mildly. Did he or does he have connections to Gazprom? That has not appeared on the record to my knowledge. But with regard to Mr. Trump, you really can't be too sure, because obviously there were a lot of murky aspects to his relationship with Russia. And the fabled report by the special counsel Robert Mueller, I'm sure you recall it from a few years ago, it brought out some evidence, but didn't bring out quite a bit. And so that's a chapter that is yet to be written.
Okay.
Okay. Brother Horne,
Yes, sir.
the Russians, as you have stated in the book you did on Paul Robeson, but they have played a very supportive role in the African American struggle. And I think a lot of our people are not aware of the support that Russia has given directly to African American leadership here in this country. So if you could speak on that, I appreciate it.
Well, yes, one of the many reasons why our friends in Southern Africa have not stood alongside the United States and its Western European allies with regard to sanctions against Moscow is because there's lingering sympathy in Southern Africa for Moscow, even with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, because Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union, because everybody knows, and if you don't know it, read it in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, that Moscow during the Soviet era armed the Africans to the teeth to fight the apartheid regime and to fight US allies. That's one of the reasons why the United States was so ecstatic when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, because they felt that a major stumbling block that was blocking the power of US imperialism had been removed from the scene. However, as we know, Moscow has recovered since 1991, which is one of the reasons why we're in the midst of a conflict. But it's not just Southern Africa. I'm working on a book now on Northeast Africa. And one of the points that I've uncovered is this, that in the 1890s, you might recall, the Italians, who were late to the colonial feast, were trying to make up for lost time by invading Ethiopia. They did the same thing again in the 1930s, as you might recall. And one of the reasons why the Italians were not able to overthrow the independent, non-colonized regime in Addis Ababa was because they were armed to the teeth by Russia. Now, you may want to try to understand how this happens. In order to understand how that happens, you have to understand a bit about European history. What I mean is that there has been a basic contradiction in European history for a few centuries now, in that as the Western Europeans were getting fat on the plunder of Africa, including the African slave trade and the plunder of the Americas, looting and pillaging the Native Americans, they were not necessarily the major power in their backyard. Speaking of Europe, I'm speaking of Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, the Western European pirates. Because if you look at your map of Europe, you'll see that most of European territory is Russian. That Russia has a population today about twice the size of the number 2 nation, which is Germany. Russia has a population of about 150, 160 million. Germany has a population of about 80, 81 million. Most of Europe's natural resources are in Russia. I've already made reference to that: palladium, natural gas, oil, titanium, which is necessary for building advanced jets. And so what happened was that there was a long time plan of the Western Europeans to really take over Russia. That was the import of Napoleon Bonaparte, who, as you know, is public enemy number 1 to this day in Haiti because of his attempt to reinsert slavery in Haiti post the success of the revolution in 1804. A few years after that, of course, you had Napoleon Bonaparte invade Russia and was defeated soundly. A few decades later, you saw Britain, France try to overthrow Russia. They weakened Russia, but it did not succeed. And to show you how seriously they took this, in 1904, 1905, you had a turning point in world history when London financed a rising Japan to make war against Russia. And of course, Japan won, and it weakened the Tsar, or the king, to the point where the communists took over by 1917. But you may recall that Du Bois, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, Sun Yat-sen of China, Nehru of India, all thought that this Japanese defeat of Russia was a turning point in the struggle against white supremacy. In other words, the British were jeopardizing white supremacy in order to overthrow Russia. And then we all know about Hitler. Hitler met his match in the 1940s when he was trying to overthrow Russia. You could make an argument that Hitler's whole campaign was about taking over Russia and all of its natural resources. And of course, that's where he was basically defeated. And then I've already made reference to what happened 50 years ago when the United States cuts a deal with China in order to weaken Russia, which basically succeeded. It weakened the Soviet Union. So there's been this obsession with Russia. And of course, you mentioned Black leaders. Well, of course, Paul Robeson is exhibit number 1. Paul Robeson, the late, great activist, singer, athlete, actor, the tallest tree in our forest, spoke fluent Russian. He educated his son, Paul Robeson Jr., who, as I recall, used to live in Brooklyn, now no longer in the land of the living. He educated his son in Russian. His son also spoke Russian and made a good living translating Russian scientific journals into English for a number of years. And of course, if you look at the history of Russia, if you speak to any Russian, be they anti-Putin or pro-Putin, they will tell you that the father of the modern Russian language is a man of African descent, speaking of Pushkin, Pushkin. Russians can recite his poetry at the drop of a hat. And the kind of exaltation that men of African descent like Pushkin and Robeson receive and have received in Russia certainly outstrips to a certain degree what their counterparts, the kind of lauding their counterparts have received here in North America.
Excuse me, Dr. Horne. I'm sorry.
set aside $45 billion for African American farmers. But then he appointed a racist pig to be over the distribution and of course Africans, and I'm from South Carolina, so I come from the farm. Has been turned around where white farmers are now suing black farmers for getting grants and support that white farmers, they claim, are not getting when they were getting tons of money for plowing their crops under the ground, corn, cotton, and so forth. But we didn't get anything. As a matter of fact, we could not raise a cash crop more than $1,000. That was our limit in South Carolina for black folk. The reason why I said I opened in terms of there's enough really for everybody on the planet, but white supremacy is so devilish, so demonic, so inhuman that unless somehow we can, I don't know, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima talks about Africans in Europe and the kinds of they did to bring Europeans out of the Dark Ages and so forth. But Europeans don't seem to have that same kind of humanity towards black people. And sometimes I just wonder why. I mean, you don't have to answer that. But if you have an insight, I sure would like to know why we can't. Because we can do this, but not with white supremacy.
Well, with regard to your latter point, this is something I've been stressing quite a bit in my own writing, is that part of the antagonism towards black people in North America not only has to do with what we've talked about at length, which is hostility to blackness, fear of a black planet. I mean, there are many theories and hypotheses along that line. But what I've been stressing is this, that we were kidnapped and brought to North America in the first instance to exploit our labor. And then what happens is that a civil war is fought. And those who lost the Civil War, including in your own South Carolina, by the way, there are billions of dollars in investment in your great-great-grandfather and your great-great-grandmother was taken without compensation. Oftentimes in my classes, when I try to illustrate this point, I'll walk up to a student who's fiddling with their smartphone, and I'll seize the smartphone and say, I've just taken your property without compensation. Now you're angry now, aren't you? You probably want to take me outside, even though I'm the professor, and kick my butt. But that's how these slave owners and their progeny, who lost billions and billions of dollars in property. And so, when they lost billions of dollars in property, the property then was supposedly to be equal to them, which was, from their estimation, saying that your mule is going to be equal to you. And then secondly, it went against their ideology, which is that black people were little more than mules. That was the whole doctrine of white supremacy, which then makes it very difficult to have any sort of understanding or entente with black people, because the loss of billions of dollars in investments makes that difficult and problematic. So I think, however, that the good news is that the way we've been able to overcome such formidable hurdles, such seemingly insurmountable hurdles, is by lengthening the battlefield. And certainly it has not involved aligning with US imperialism and US white supremacy in its wars against US imperialism's antagonists. Instead, what we try to do is cut a deal with US imperialism's antagonists. For example, one of the reasons why slavery collapsed in this country was because we cut a deal with the Haitian revolutionaries, who were a major antagonist of the slave owners in South Carolina, for example. And that helped to put so much pressure on slavery that it led to a civil war where we were free. And so likewise, when you look at US apartheid or Jim Crow, one of the reasons it begins to retreat about 75 odd years ago was that as African nations were coming to independence, the United States was competing for hearts and minds in Africa, like Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana coming to independence in 1957, but found that difficult as long as Black people were being treated so atrociously here. So that creates a dynamic for the retreat of Jim Crow. Part of the problem today, and that's why I'm so happy to speak with you two gentlemen this afternoon, is that many of our leaders and thought leaders and other kinds of leaders have really lost track of what's going on outside of the United States, which is very dangerous because, as you were just suggesting, the right wing of the United States is on the march right now. They want to put Donald J. Trump back in office. They are trying to rig the election laws so that they will never lose another election, particularly at the presidential level. They are not seizing in their funding of the prison industrial complex, putting the finest flower of our youth behind bars. And so it's a real crisis. And the way we've dealt with those crises in the past is lengthening the battlefield, making global alliances, and putting pressure on our enemies here at home.
Dr. Horne, in response to what you just said, I agree. In fact, I think that it's internationalizing this Trump phenomenon. And what's even more disturbing is that the Ukraine is getting billions of dollars to some military that has been infiltrated, the Ukrainian military, which has been infiltrated by neo-Nazis. In fact, I've heard reports that there are calls for mercenaries, or it's a call for right-wing extremists to come to the Ukraine to get battle experience, so that can be spread on a globe and dispersed at a global level. Now, at the same time, the history of the support that Russia gave to African countries throughout the diaspora is legendary. But one question that needs to be raised is the government, in principle, of the Russia of Vladimir Putin the same as the Russia of the Soviet Union that gave its support over the decades and made it possible for Cuba to fight back the South African regime and stop apartheid in its tracks? Right? Is Putin still a socialist, or is it, in the words of Dr. John Henry Clark, where we have no friends?
Well, I think we have friends. Point number one. Point number two is that you are correct with the import of your question, is that the Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of the past. There is no doubt about that. The Russia of today, however, still has contradictions with the United States and its allies, and therefore, in a bid to gain allies, will seek to have friendly relations with Cuba, friendly relations with Venezuela, and friendly relations with Nicaragua, all of whom have problems with Washington. And in some ways that mimics Soviet policy, but there is no doubt that there is a substantial difference between the Soviet period and today's Moscow, today's Russia. Putin is no socialist. However, Russia has been forced to develop a public sector. One of the points that distinguishes socialists from capitalists is that socialists believe in public schools, capitalists believe in private schools. Socialists believe in public roads, you can just drive in the streets. Capitalists believe in tolls. You have to pay a toll like you do in New York whenever you cross a bridge or something like that. Man, people have been paying that money for decades, so who knows where it's going, although I have a thought about that. So Russia, because of pressure from the capitalist countries, has been forced to maintain a public sector. However, your point is well taken, and we should not delude ourselves into thinking that there hasn't been a change since 1991 and the overthrow of the Soviet Union. However, what we need to do is look at the compatibilities. That is to say, the enemy of my enemy oftentimes is my friend. The enemy of Washington right now is Moscow. We have a problem with Washington. And so therefore, we should consider reaching out. I mean, for example, if you go if you go to one of my Facebook pages, you'll see that I'm on Russian sponsored radio about 3 or 4 times a week. And before they deleted it all from YouTube, I was on Russian RT, Russian television, about once a week. A lot of it's been deleted now because the United States has struck back. So I say all that to say that we should be alert to the contradictions that you sketch in your question, but I think it would be a mistake to think that we have no friends, because we have no friends. We're stuck with people who a popular religion says are devils. If that's the case, we're doomed, and I don't think we're doomed. I think I'm on Iranian television a lot. You can usually find that on YouTube or on one of my Facebook pages. And the Iranians, if you look at Iranian television, they're always talking about police killings. They would love to have Black Americans come and talk about bringing a case before the United Nations, putting U.S. imperialism in the dock. But the problem is that our leaders don't think in that direction. I don't know why. I guess they felt that when the U.S. Supreme Court was overthrowing or eroding Jim Crow, that would be the case forever. Well, obviously, it's not the case forever, because you have a right-wing Supreme Court led by a Black man by the name of Clarence Thomas. So the short answer is we're not doomed. We do have friends, but we have to reach out to our friends. And I see that we've reached about an hour in terms of our conversation, so we should wind down. And Mr. or Reverend Brown, you should let me know if we're going to do this again next week.
Yeah, I'd love to. Looking forward to it. Let me just thank another one of our engineers, Sister Moshe. Sister Moshe, would you like to have anything to say to Dr. Horne before we go off?
No, I do not. I will wait until the next time where I have more time.
Okay.
So that'll be same time, 4 o'clock Eastern, Thursday, April 28th.
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll be here.
Looking forward.
Right on. Hey,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
to the extent that you can, send me links for our conversations.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
absolutely.
Okay, good luck.
All right now. Peace.
Bye-bye.